we have emphasizing this all the way through. The FLAR considers that seeking, promoting dialogue with regards to public policies at a regional, national and global level is a significant contribution in order to reach macroeconomic and financial stability across Latin America and the Caribbean. Now, technology has enabled us to attain this goal by using these technologies in the face of the adverse circumstances posed by the pandemic. The outbreak of COVID-19 in the region occurred in a context of vulnerability in the region after 4 to 5 years of low economic growth. Despite the heterogeneity of indicators from the different countries, it's a fact that most countries showed high levels of informality and also weak social and health systems. At the same time, many countries had high public debt and very little fiscal space. On the other hand, some economies in the region did not have many international funds, and only 8 countries in the regions were members or are members to FLAR. So in 2020, Latin America and the Caribbean have reported more than 430,000 deaths as a result of COVID-19, and it has been one of the regions hit the hardest in the world, not only because of the number of infections and deaths, but also because of the economic and financial fallout of the pandemic. Across countries, we have observed a significant production and employment shrinkage, mainly as a result of lockdown due to the health emergency and a drop in foreign demand. Despite some recovery in the price of commodities and money coming from abroad, we can see that the impact in this region has been worse than in other countries, and also because the policies for this situation in many countries is quite limited. The region was particularly hit, just like the rest of the world, and this led to a significant capital outflow along with increased sovereign spreads and the devaluation of several currencies in the region. Fortunately, this was a short-term shock only thanks to the unprecedented response given by the Fed from the United States and the central banks in the region. However, nothing can guarantee that crises of this sort may not occur again at some point in the future. So far the policies that have been adopted have allowed for the financial stability of the region, but we are facing stark challenges. The most compelling ones being fostering the economies while keeping investors' confidence amidst the fear with regards to the sustainability of public debt, and also due to the inflationary pressure that may occur during the recovery process. At the same time, we need to access or guarantee access to external financing, not only by private markets, but also access to financing by international organizations. So international cooperation is required by the region in order to bolster a sustained recovery based on the macroeconomic and financial stability of our countries, which is critical in order to allow the economic rebound. So we need a sound economic lifeline, and FLAR is certainly a regional component in this respect. So in this backdrop, the Board of Directors of FLAR approved during the first half of 2020 an increase of 62% in its financing capacity to member countries. Therefore, we would be able in the future to allocate resources should it be deemed relevant up to a significant amount, including not only our own resources, but also the possibility of acquiring debt in international markets. The Board of Directors also approved the creation of an exceptional credit line, which is going to be a temporary one in order to help member countries to face the issues that arise from their balance of payment due to COVID-19. So we are talking about credit facilities with up to 3 grace 3-year grace periods, and also with regards to our traditional balance of payments. So we are facing huge efforts in this conference, the need of increase our collaboration among countries. The FLAR has proven to be a multilateral body, and by having new member countries, we would have the potential of having a greater regional impact. So remember that for the time being, FLAR only has 8 member countries, and no doubt if we had more member countries, we would be able to increase our supporting capacity in situations like the one we are experiencing right now. So we believe that this dialogue space is very important because it enables us to discuss the current situation and the future challenges posed by international financial cooperation and multilateral participation. So we have an expert on this subject matter, Professor José Antonio Ocampo. So I would like to warmly welcome you all to this webinar. Thank you for attending. Thank you so much, Mr. Executive President, for your address. Now, Ms. Alistair, Executive Secretary of the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, will take the floor. She is the very first woman at ECLAC taking this position since July 2008. She was also Adjunct Executive Secretary and Director of other areas in these institutions, and she was also Secretary General, and she was Chief of Cabinet and Deputy Chief of Cabinet at the United Nations, and she also worked as professor at the University of Mexico. So we would like to welcome Ms. Alicia Bárcena. Good morning, everybody. I would like to greet José Darío Uribe, who is the Executive President of FLAR. It was really great that we were able to speak in order to organize this academic gathering, mainly because at ECLAC we have been tabling again and again the significance of having such an institution like FLAR in the region. This is one of the fewest regions in the world having such an organization. So now what we have to do all together is to drive the role played by FLAR. So I would like to thank FLAR for allowing us to organize this webinar jointly. Our speaker today is José Antonio Ocampo. We know that he was Executive Secretary at ECLAC. He was also responsible for the Economic and Social Department at the UN. So thank you so much also for being the moderator. I would like to thank other colleagues from our organization and other dear friends who are attending. I believe that it's very important to hold this seminar, dear José Darío Uribe, because we are living in an unprecedented context in the region, and it is high time that we take steady actions with regards to international financial cooperation. And Latin America and the Caribbean cannot lag behind because this is the region that has been hit the hardest in terms of development. And that is one of the aspects that we have to tackle, because sometimes international cooperation organizations, the IMF, the World Bank, and even our own institution give priority to Africa, leaving Latin America and the Caribbean aside, thinking that since we are a medium income region, except for some countries, we don't need help. But that shouldn't be so. Actually, we need to rethink what kind of support a region like ours may require, because COVID-19 will certainly expand the financing gap in Latin America and the Caribbean. Between 2019 and 2020, there will be an increase of 46 to 53.6% in terms of public debt on the country's GDP. So the debt service will grow from 49.8 to 57% on the total export of goods and services. So we will have to allocate to the debt service about 50% or 57% of all the income coming from the export of goods and services, and no doubt this is a topic to be tackled. And we need to have a well-coordinated response and increased cooperation and communication among international organizations, recognizing the heterogeneity in the countries in the region, because the response of multilateral financial institutions at a global level has been a fragmented one and quite insufficient in terms of scale and in terms of addressing the heterogeneity and the specific financial requirements that our region has according to the size and the financing capabilities that each country has. So multilateral financial institutions need to step up the scope of financing, because the IMF's emergency financing instrument granted to 20 countries in the region allowed for 64 billion euros to be granted, 1.6 over GDP and 6.1 over the export of goods and services, but that's not enough in order to bridge the financing gap, because we still need to cover a lot more. The only thing we are solving through this fund by the IMF is 26%, or we have to go beyond that financing gap, because we would be covering only 26% of the financing requirements that these 20 countries have. Yesterday, we held a very important meeting with the Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Antonio Gutierrez, who talked about financing for development. And he said, well, he knows that FLAR needs to be bolstered. So we discussed what we need from the World Bank and the IMF. The World Bank, for example, is focusing on low-income countries, and they consider non-concessional lending to medium-income countries. In Latin America, we received and we shall receive 2.8% of the total financing to be granted by the World Bank. The remnant will be allocated to African countries. So we made it very clear that it's quite compelling that multilateral international banks extend their portfolio, that they get a capital increase, and that credit granting terms and facilities are eased. This, on the other hand, should not compromise their capacity as preferred creditors. So this is another topic that we need to face. For example, the IDB is trying to obtain a capital increase from 12 billion to 20 billion, but then there are other banks, like, for example, the Development Bank of Latin America, that also need to be bolstered. Therefore, we need to move in this direction, and we need to aim at these national and international organizations. National organizations have committed about 34 billion euros in the multilateral international banks in the region. In the case of Brazil, we're talking about a significant case. But one of the topics that I'm sure that José Antonio Ocampo will address has to do with the need to increase liquidity by reallocating and reissuing what we call special drawing rights. So we believe that a new allocation of SDRs in the amount of 500 billion might account for 56 billion US dollars for Latin American and Caribbean economies, 2.5 billion for the Caribbean. So this would account for a significant increase in international reserves in the case of countries that may need this urgently. So FLAR has a key role to play in this respect, and that's what we believe, that it's possible to bolster FLAR through these mechanisms. We also analyzed another proposal by Costa Rica in order to alleviate the impact of COVID-19, in order to funnel liquidity facilities in the amount of $500 million. So we recognize this, and thank you, Dr. Uribe, for allowing us to access your paper in order to strengthen the position of FLAR. We see that FLAR set into motion significant initiatives in order to boost access to liquidity and financial stability. So the resources that you made available to your member countries was really very important, because we're talking about nearly 7 billion US dollars. But in fact, you need to expand the number of member countries. This is no doubt something that we need to focus on. We need to persuade countries such as Mexico, or large economies, Argentina, Brazil, about the need of joining FLAR, because we need regional solidarity. And I believe that through the credit lines that you're now granting, you can really help countries to address their balance of payment issues that will be triggered off by COVID-19. So dear friends, increased access to liquidity is necessary, but it's not sufficient. We also need to strive to push the G20 initiative for debt reduction. Here we are talking about increasing the coverage of this initiative, especially in order to include the smaller economies. What I find quite interesting, and I hope that José Antonio will elaborate on this, is how can we increase participation and contribution by private stakeholders. This is a pending issue. We need to understand how we can make sure that the private sector can actually start thinking out of the box, and they can realize that this is a systemic crisis, and it will not only affect developed countries but also developing countries and other countries. In the median income countries account for 96% of the global public debt. So it's very important to talk about debt-related issues and about how we can support some kind of sovereign debt restructuring altogether. There's a great deal of concern internationally. I believe that this is one of the first times where the Secretary General of the United Nations committed himself directly to address these topics. So after this wonderful academic gathering, I believe that we can draw some conclusions that could be subsequently elevated to the global topics that need to be discussed as well. So it would be great if we can continue working together, supporting one of the regional institutions that we're very fond of. I'm talking about FLAR. So we believe that FLAR needs to be further bolstered so that it can play the role it should play in the forthcoming years. Thank you very much, Carlos Giraldo. Thank you very much, Dr. José Uribe. I'm delighted to be here, and I hope this is not the last occasion that we can share this discussion. We are highly privileged and delighted to do this with you. Thank you very much, Ms. Bárcena. Next, there will be a presentation by Professor José Antonio Ocampo, followed by a short Q&A session. José Antonio Ocampo is a professor of the Economic and Political Development Concentration in the School of International and Public Affairs. He's also a member of the Committee of Global Thought and co-president of the Initiative for Policy Dialogue at Columbia University. He's also the chair of the Committee for Development Policy. He was Secretary General at the United Nations Economic and Social Council. He was also Secretary at ECLAC. He was Minister of Agriculture. He was also responsible for planning and co-director of the Bank of the Republic. As a faculty member, he taught at the University of Los Andes and the National University of Colombia. He was also fellow fellow professor at universities such as Cambridge, Oxford, and Yale. Now I would like to give the floor to José Antonio Campo, who will talk about international financial cooperation and the Latin American economic crisis. So you have the floor, Professor Antonio Ocampo. Thank you very much, Carlos, for your kind introduction. I'm delighted to participate at this forum that has been jointly organized by FLAR, an organization that I hope will someday become the Latin American Monetary Fund, and also ECLAC. I spent spent several years of my professional career at CLAC, so I'm very fond of this organization as well. I would like to start out by extending my appreciation to José Darío Uribe and Elisa Bárcena for inviting me, and also Carlos Giraldo and Ms. Ines Bustillo from CEPAL, from ECLAC, for organizing this webinar. I should say, to start with, that will provide you with an updated analysis based on an article that was published by ECLAC's magazine in August. This was some work that was entrusted to me with regards to the current financial situation in Latin America as a result of COVID-19. So let me start with a general discussion, then I will talk about international cooperation during the crisis. Next, I will focus on how Latin American countries have been supported through the crisis. And thirdly, I will refer to private financing in this context, because that has been a major surprise amid this crisis. And finally, I will draw some conclusions. So let me start by showing my presentation. So let me start by providing you with some context. So this international crisis, as I mentioned, was characterized by the clash between aggressive internal policies of developed countries and limited international cooperation, setting a major difference with the way in which the crisis was handled by the G20 back in 2008 and 2009, where international cooperation was high. This was particularly true in the United States, where certain policies were implemented by the Fed. But on the other hand, international cooperation has also been quite recurrent. We hope that the new US administration will be far more open to international cooperation. For example, some SDRs were not approved mainly because of the decision made by the United States. Other countries, like for example Japan and European countries, took a more balanced approach to the financial crisis. The Fed implemented a swap line in 2008 that also rendered some significant effects in terms of liquidity in US dollars. But this was allocated only to a few emerging economies, namely Brazil and Mexico. Some resources were also allocated to South Korea, but those are high-income countries. And then we have another piece of news, and that was the Fed repo facility. That is also quite an interesting facility. If we compare how both crises were managed, first we have to take into account the program that was perhaps the most ambitious international cooperation program, and I'm talking about the issue of SDRs in the amount of $250 billion. Also, the most significant reform of the IMF's credit lines, and also the capital increase and credit increase of multilateral development banks, and a highly ambitious reform in terms of financial regulation, and also an increase and redistribution of the IMF quotas. And finally, in 2012, there was a significant program that was put in place by the OECD with regards to international tax cooperation. And finally, in 2012, there were other initiatives in terms of capital inflow that was put in place by the IMF. So, as the heads of state mentioned in May, they said during the meeting that we have to do whatever is necessary in order to overcome the crisis and use all the policies available. However, the United States vetoed the issue of SDRs. Then there was an increase in the IMF's emergency financing for an additional 2 months. So there was no decision made with regards to increasing capital, and we also see debt initiatives being rather modest. So in practice, we can say that we are still under the threat of the commercial or trade war between China and the United States. So what is it that was agreed with regards to monetary cooperation, where the IMF's emergency financing lines were two-folded? This happened in March, and it was extended for an additional 2 months. So this approval process became automatic, so that is good news. However, traditional facilities were hardly used. We can highlight the flexible credit line used by several Latin American countries, as I will describe later. So these resources that have been used are rather modest. The only credit line that was approved was a liquidity line for the short term, but I should say that it's not going to be used eventually because it's a modest line, and it's a renewable line of up to 145% of the country's quota. So countries will prefer to use flexible credit lines. In the case of Chile, they were extending their quota 10-fold, Mexico 5-fold, etc. So this is much more ambitious than the short-term facility that I mentioned before. Then the Fed swap line is going to be used, but to a lower extent and for a shorter period of time compared to the previous crisis, and regional funds have not been much used. So this is a snapshot of the different IMF credit lines broken down by countries. So here you see the credits that are flexible credit lines, and those that do not need to be disbursed. They are considered to be additional international reserves that countries can disburse or not. So those that are subjected to disbursement account for 50 billion euros, and they involve 93 countries. In fact, the three flexible credit lines are a lot more than was granted through other lines. In total, we're talking about more than 100 billion US dollars, and that is a lot less than the managing director of IMF, Kristalina Georgieva, said when they say that they would need 1 billion or 1 trillion in the United States. That's the amount she said that was actually needed. So this is what was used during the 2008 and 2009 crisis, and here we see the amounts used during this crisis. Here we see the euro crisis, where a little less was used. Well, we're talking about 450 million US dollars, and that was a lot less than what was used in the previous crisis. And again, this was used only for a 6-month term. Then the credit line was no longer used. In 2008 and 2009, in total, the credit line was used for a total period of 1 year. From the Multilateral Development Bank's perspective, we can highlight the program that was approved by the World Bank in March in the amount of 160 billion US dollars for the next 15 months. That is larger than the package approved in 2009-2010, and that is mainly geared to low-income countries that surprisingly received less support than in the previous crisis. Other multilateral development banks need capital increases, but apparently no initiatives have been put in place for such capital increase. However, the World Bank was able to move forward because this bank received a capital increase in 2018, and the African Development Bank that also received a capital increase in 2019. And then we have other banks like, for example, the International Bank of Reconstruction, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, but that's a smaller one. So the IMF decided to provide a debt service relief to 29 countries. At first, this was going to be a 6-month suspension, but now it's going to go all the way through 2021. And then there is another initiative that was mentioned by the Secretary of ECLAC. Here we are talking about the debt service suspension granted to poor countries within the scope of the International Development Association, or IDA. So this was the first time when a debt reduction possibility was mentioned, as well as a debt deferral. The same happened in the case of China, that adopted a similar policy, but on a case-by-case basis. Our region, we can highlight the debt renegotiation of Argentina and Ecuador in August with the implicit support of the IMF, but there are no specific measures targeted at medium-income countries. So the IMF and World Bank meetings held in October, and the IMF managing director recently said before the G20 that more ambitious measures should be implemented with regards to foreign debt. In Latin America, we can highlight the flexible credit lines that were granted to Chile and Peru, and the extension of the credit line given to Colombia. So these credit lines are like a supplement to international reserves. In the case of Peru, it twofolded the quota by 6. In the case of Colombia, it was also expanded to 6. And in the case of Mexico, it was 5-folded. So several countries had access to emergency financing, but these are limited resources. Other credits included the renewal of credit lines given to Ecuador, another credit line given to Honduras, and now there are some renegotiations going on with Argentina in good terms. As I said, the lack of issue of SDRs was quite unfortunate, having a significant impact on Latin America. So FLAR has 6.776 billion in terms of financing available, but no credits were granted in 2019 and 2020, and only 123 million is now being used. So this is another snapshot showing Latin America and all the countries that received support. All in all, in the amount of 62 billion US dollars. These are flexible credit lines. There was an extension of the credit line given to Colombia, and also in the case of Ecuador and Honduras. But only 10.8 billion was granted all in all for all other countries. So this is quite a humble amount if we take into account current financing needs. And now I will elaborate further on this. So these are my estimates as to the effects of issuing 500 billion US dollars in SDRs in Latin America, would account for 0.7% over GDP, therefore with a significant increase on international reserves. GDP, however, has gone down in US dollars compared to the quota that these countries have on the IMF, as the case of Venezuela and Nicaragua. But in other countries, we're talking between 0.6 and 0.7% over the country's GDP. That is to say, a much more significant contribution compared to the amounts given to these countries through credit lines. So FLAR has significant financing capability to its member countries, about 2.689 billion, and we hope that member countries increase. In the long run, FLAR should be a Latin American monetary fund, also including the Caribbean region. but we didn't see many countries joining except for Uruguay, Costa Rica, and Paraguay lately. In my personal opinion about FLAR, right now, there are not only balance of payment needs, but also fiscal support needs. Therefore, we should make sure that FLAR's credits could also be used for fiscal purposes. That is exactly what happens with the IMF's funds. So we would just be applying the IMF's policy to FLAR's policy, but that has not yet been accepted by FLAR's member countries. Talking about multilateral development banks in Latin America, their approach has not been very fortunate either. The most important multilateral organizations are the IDB, the Development Bank of Latin America, that need a capital increase. As for the Central American Bank for Economic Integration, they could provide important support, because in that case they had a capital increase in April of about 40%. On the other hand, the World Bank has increased its credits to Latin America more or less at the same level at that as 2009-2010, and they more or less reached therefore the same level, and they played a significant role, reporting an increase of 153% in terms of the credits granted to Latin American countries on average. However, multilateral banks increased the credits they have granted this year by 15% only compared to previous periods. So this is a slide showing the main financing sources in the region, including the World Bank, the IDB, also the Central American Bank for Economic Integration, and CAF. During the 2009 and 2010 crisis, the World Bank played a significant role that was repeated during the past crisis. This is exactly what we can see in terms of equity of these institutions. In the case of the CABEI, there was a significant capital increase in 2007 compared to the IDB and the World Bank. So in the case of the CABEI, this is the institution with the largest capital increase compared to the other banks. So these are some preliminary data, my own estimates. However, you can see that the IDB and the CAF this year, they have been increasing the number of credits. This increase has, however, been particularly important in the case of the World Bank, where they were able to increase their credits to Latin America by 150%. In the case of other multilateral banks, their allocation was quite modest. However, we were positively surprised by the private capital markets during this crisis. In fact, we observed that the private capital market bounced back much faster compared to previous crises. To put it simply, we can say that it was able to bounce back in 2 months compared to the 12-month period that it took to recover in the previous crisis. So it was really quite a positive surprise during the past crisis. So first it was an initial capital outflow that was quite sharp, but since mid-April, access to these capital markets began to pick up with some delays in other market segments. So in my opinion, the main reason of the behind has to do with the Fed's measures. These have been the most expansion-oriented measures ever taken by the Fed, causing a very quick recovery of the economy worldwide. Since late March, we began to see that with some lagging in mid-April or with some delay in mid-April in the case of Latin America. In February and March, Latin America also began to have access to the resources, and this is based on the information provided by a CLAC report on capital flows to Latin America, showing an increase of 23% in terms of sovereign and quasi-sovereign issues in Q2 and Q3 vis-a-vis the same period last year. So this is an additional financing source given to Latin America with risk margins that at first were quite high. Right now, however, we have financing terms and conditions that are more flexible for countries that have access to this market. So this is what happened to emerging economies in terms of capital flows. Well, here we see a period that was catastrophic with significant capital outflows. But in April, in the second half of April, we see hard currency bonds that began to perform quite positively as of June compared to previous years, such as 2017 or 2019, where there were very positive levels of financing. And also the figures are quite positive compared to January this year. Other segments recovered more slowly, particularly in the case of local currency bonds between June and July. However, they show quite a good performance, and in September and October, they also performed positively. So this is the account provided by a CLAC with regards to capital flows allocated to Latin American countries. So this is the behavior of financing in the second quarter and the third quarter. Here we're talking about sovereign and quasi-sovereign bonds involving many sub-regional development banks. In 2008-2009, there was quite a drought for 6 months running. And the same applies to Q3 2018 and some quarters during 2015. So this is the performance of the bond market in Latin America and the Caribbean, which proved to be exceptional. With regards to risk margins, the situation was far better compared to 2008-2009 or other prior crises. As you can see here, there was an initial increase in risk margins, therefore bond yields were affected. However, it was different compared to 2008-2009, and this lasted less time. We are talking about a 6-month period only. There was a period where yields were affected. That's why some countries had exceptional financing terms and conditions, such as the bond that was issued by Mexico in May. It's the best bond ever issued in its history, or the bond issued by Colombia. They were two of the best bonds ever issued in history, because we are talking about 30-year term bonds. So that was really very positive. So I therefore come to the closing, and let me draw some conclusions. International cooperation has been highly limited compared to 2008 and 2009. However, the Federal Reserve's monetary policy allowed for the private market's reactivation, and that certainly favored countries that had access to capital markets, that is to say the bulk of Latin American countries, as a matter of fact. However, this could have reduced the other kinds of financing with mainly with other factors, with an improvement in the balance of payment. I believe that there was in fact an improvement of the balance of payment, and there was a reduction in the demand for IMF and FLAR resources. We can say that there has been an improvement in Latin American countries' balance of payments, and not actually because they increased their exports, countries were able to also use flows from the private capital markets. Now, if the question is, if the crisis lingers, will there be more international support? Well, my answer is that maybe there will be more international support and even some debt financing, refinancing. It's quite clear that this pandemic will take much longer than we thought. So once again, thank you very much for inviting me to deliver this webinar. Thank you very much, Professor Ocampo, for your thorough presentation. I would like to say that international financial cooperation during the COVID-19 crisis. Now, I would like to pose some questions that we have picked up in advance. We have one first block of questions concerning what you have just mentioned. During this crisis, access to the private capital market picked up quite quickly, maybe as a result of the responsiveness given by the United States Federal Reserve. Bearing this in mind, let me ask three questions. Question number one, can this be construed as the fact that international organizations have the right capacity for financing in the region? And do you think that in the case of multilateral development banks and in the case of those organizations that believe that work for macro financial stability such as FLAR and the IMF. And to which extent do you think that the monetary policy of the Fed will continue to play the role that it has been playing that has been played by private capital flows in the EMs, including emerging economies in our region? Let me start with the last question first, and then we'll address the other two. I believe that the Fed's commitment is the one of keeping a very expansive monetary policy. However, a decision was made by the Trump administration to suspend or to not to allow the Fed to participate in the financing given by the private sector, and that was actually a big surprise. Perhaps the next administration will change this approach. One of the characteristics of the Fed and also one of the characteristics of the ECB is that it supports private markets, not only buying bonds from the US Treasury. Now, in the short term, we believe that it has been positive because private stakeholders in the United States welcome quite favorably the fact that Biden was elected president, and also the appointment of the new head of the Fed. This has been taken as a great piece of news. So I'm rather optimistic, and I believe that we will still see the Federal Reserve working hand in hand with the Treasury, especially in the context of the pandemic that is getting worse, and that could also trigger off a second economic downturn in the United States. Then the IMF has sufficient resources. Now the question is, why is it that countries do not resort to the IMF more? Now the million-dollar question here is whether the terms and conditions imposed continue to be a hindrance for these countries, or whether, as I said at the end of my presentation, because there's sufficient international liquidity and countries do not need to resort to the IMF. other countries in Latin America that have great international financial reserves, and therefore they have another support source. Brazil is quite a significant example in this respect. Now, I believe that multilateral development banks support should be augmented, because actually fiscal deficits should be perhaps higher in order to support economic recovery in Latin America and the Caribbean. In fact, I believe that the IDB, the Development Bank of Latin America, or the CAF would need a capital increase. But right now, there were some issues in the Congress of the United States, but now let's wait and see what happens with the new administration. I believe that it was great, however, that some Republican representatives congratulated Biden for winning the elections. So we have to wait and see what happens with Biden. They talked about the fact that some capital increase initiatives will be put in place. I think that perhaps a more ambitious initiative is required. As Alicia mentioned, she talked about the initiative that was pushed by the President of Costa Rica called a FAST, that would allow for long-term credits at zero interest rates or moderate interest rates in order to allow for further development of developing economies. There are other initiatives in the pipeline, some of which I quite like. For example, voluntary refinancing mechanisms of private debt that could be done through the support of multilateral development banks. This is an initiative that I also found quite interesting. But with regards to EM's public debt, nothing has been mentioned so far. Thank you so much, Professor Ocampo. There's a second block of questions that is associated to the fallout of the current crisis in the public sector and households that can be quite deep and long-lasting in the region. In this regard, I would like to know which variables and indicators do you think that should be monitored closely in order to see how stable our economies will be from a financial and economic perspective, and which takeaway lessons do we have from the current crisis in terms of economic impact? Well, as for the macroeconomic indicators that have been impaired significantly as a result of the crisis, we can point to production activity affecting mainly SMEs, which account for the main sources of employment according to a joint paper prepared by ECLAC and the World Trade Organization, the ILO. Apparently 47% of employment will drop in the region, even though there has been some recovery in some countries like Colombia, but 5 million jobs have already been lost. All the same, 2 million jobs is quite a lot, and we are talking about the unemployment rate having reached historic highs in the Latin American region. So production activity has been hit, and also SMEs. So perhaps these are the two most important aspects to be highlighted. And then public debt and fiscal deficit. Here we are talking about a drop in income. There are some countries that increased expenditure quite significantly. That is the case of Peru, Chile, and Brazil. Those countries increased their spending markedly, but others did not follow suit, and they did not use the right fiscal resources. So this is another critical component, as Alicia pointed out. So again, public debt in the region reached historic highs as a result of this crisis. And the fiscal situation will also be just as difficult. So what can we do in this respect? Well, I believe that we need to prepare support measures in order to bolster employment as well as small and medium-sized companies. So that is, in Colombia, for example, we proposed an unemployment subsidy by granting credits. These are credits that will be only partially amortized or repaid, provided that job is or work is created or jobs are created. I like that initiative because it's a good way to capitalize SMEs through credits. So that could be one proposal or one formula. Then we have tax costs, and we also need to continue providing support to vulnerable groups and low-income households. At the clock, we can discuss these initiatives. So here we're talking about tax resources causing the flip side of the coin to be even more complex. So we do need a highly ambitious strategy. There was an UN and ECLAC forum with regards to the so-called FACE initiative. This is an initiative that is worth analyzing, and this could be implemented through multilateral development banks. It could be an exceptional policy. We are talking about a proposal of 500 billion US dollars. This is what the managing director of the IMF said that it would be necessary, or 1/5 that developing countries will need all in all, because they talked about $2 billion. That is 2 trillion actually, twice as much as what was initially considered by that initiative. Well, if all participants allow us, and since we have some interesting questions coming in, we will raise some more questions. You say that the current account increased despite of the fiscal deficit in the region. Do you think that this might change during an economic rally? Well, yes, no doubt. Well, talking about trade accounts or balance of payments, that was a significant drop of exports. However, exports are now picking up again. Latin America recovered its level of trade, going back to pre-crisis level in terms of volumes, but only in terms of income because of oil-producing countries. As José Darío Uribe said at the beginning, the price of commodities is climbing back up. However, well, we're not taking into account the import of services. We know that the tourism industry and air travel are two industries that have been particularly hit. For example, Latam and Avianca affected the countries where they are from. Therefore, there is a much more serious situation going on in those cases. But imports came down even more. Therefore, the balance of payment improved. But we believe that imports should climb back up much more quickly at some point in the future, with an impact on the current account of countries. As for the investment savings ratio, talking about the current account, we see in the world two significant phenomena. On the one hand, private investment plummeting and increased household savings. Households are saving a lot more. We could mention the case of the United States, where Professor Stickman said that according to their estimates, the U.S. households do not actually save. That's not customary. However, in Q2, they say that households saved up to 25% of their income. So households increased their savings rate. So if we take into account that with the size of investment, we see that impact on the balance of payment we were talking about. The only instrument available in this case is to increase public spending, as Professor Keynes would say. Okay, let us start the last block of questions. The first question is the following. In the current crisis, coordination seems to be more necessary than ever between all the global stakeholders such as the IMF. So how do you think that this can be reinforced in the different regions? And next, the pandemic is a global problem and it requires that we vanquish the virus worldwide. Do you think that a multilateral approach, not only in the health system, but also in the financial system, could be invigorated in the forthcoming months or years? Well, first of all, I should say that I have the possibility of proposing some ideas with regards to a potential collaboration between the IMF and a CLAC. And I tried to organize a meeting with the IMF managing director and the heads of the regional funds. Regional funds were not used, nor was the European fund or the Chiang Mai fund. They have not been used up to date. Only the Euro-Asian and Arabic funds, which are relatively small, have been used so far. Now, in my opinion, the relationship between the IMF and regional funds should resemble the one that exists between the World Bank and regional banks. And the IMF very often acts as the coordinator of cooperation. I believe that the World Bank should work hand in hand with regional banks. For that reason, I believe that there should be some kind of parallel financing with plenty of dialogue, that countries' policies should be analyzed, and we should also analyze the international terms and conditions of underlying instruments and debt. I believe that subordination of regional funds to the IMF would not be very suitable. Something that I like with regards to the World Bank compared to regional funds, and that is competition. When I was the Minister of Finance in Colombia, one of the privileges that Colombia has is that we normally can access the World Bank, the IDB, and the IMF, and we can see which one can offer us the best possible terms and conditions. So I believe that competition among multilateral development banks is always positive. We should seek that kind of competition because it's positive. The same applies to international monetary funds. There should be some kind of international cooperation. As you know, in the case of FLAR, there were several countries at some point in time only want to negotiate with FLAR, not the IMF, including Colombia back in the 80s. Followed by Venezuela and Ecuador. Therefore, that also gives countries, well, a range of choices in terms of financing. So I believe that perhaps this approach of the IMF is not the most suitable one with regards to regional funds. The pandemic, strictly speaking, does not actually need to be eradicated worldwide. However, once the vaccine is available, well, actually the vaccine is available, but we need to market the vaccine. We need to make sure that there is true access to tests. I believe that health cooperation is critical in this context. But I believe that economic cooperation should be stepped up. If in financial terms, the main problem that EMs and developing countries have is that they cannot increase their public spending sufficiently in order to tackle the emergency. If the pandemic is prolonged into the future, as it may seem that will happen, I believe that different mechanisms will be required in order to support the financing given by governments in emerging countries and developing countries. As for trade, the situation is a bit more complex. Trade reactivation was quite quick. I say that international trade needed at least 1.5 years in order to climb back in the 2008-2009 crisis. However, now it was able to rally within 6 months only. So that recovery was much faster, but it was asymmetric. We see that there was a dramatic rally in Chinese exports. China is exporting a lot more than last year, whereas here, here we see a bottom line problem that we need to analyze, and we hope that the World Trade Organization new managing director will take care of this issue. And we hope that new trade negotiations can be started in order to overcome the current problems. The world trade that was quite dynamic until 2008-2009 has been growing quite slowly since then. However, here there's another trade-related issue that needs to be overcome, and we hope that with the new World Trade Organization managing director, this problem will be overcome. This will also hinge upon the negotiations to be held between the US administration and the Chinese government, and also between European countries and China. Thank you, Professor Ocampo, for your excellent presentation and for answering the questions we raised. I believe that we are right on time, but we still have 2 more minutes. So I'd like to turn to the Executive Secretary of ECLAC so she can once again address the floor for some closing remarks. Well, thank you very much, Carlos, Geraldo, and José Antonio, for such an extraordinary presentation. I believe that we have to move towards the creation of a financial safety net for development that can actually use the different instruments such as the development banks, among others. And also we need to analyze regional reserve funds such as FLAR, not only as a global instance. Actually, these organizations can be a good way to reinforce the current regional architecture, contributing to financial stability and development. We should try to see whether we can take one step further, as José Antonio said, that is whether FLAR could at some point in time explore further cooperation with countries where more fiscal space may be needed. This is going to be one of the hot topics in the future years. If the region grew by 1.8% as of next year, and we hope it will, if it can grow at such a rate, we'll be able to recover the economic activity reporting in 2019 by 2025 only. Therefore, we're talking about a very hard hit. And 1.8 is the growth trend reported by the region in the past 10 years. So, dear Carlos, I believe that these events enable us to throw some light and the fact that the pandemic has taken a hit on demand on the general public, and now we need to take some short-term measures. I believe that states have played a very important role. They do not have, however, all the instruments they need, and that's why we have to provide them with fiscal support. No doubt, because that's how we can support households and enterprises in turn. Professor Ocampo talked about two priorities. First, to bolster up companies or enterprises, and then bolster up households and governments' fiscal systems. But we should not forget that investment in the region this year dropped by 20% virtually. And that's very serious because investment plummeted compared to other parts of the world. So in the medium and in the short term, we need to start working right away. So I hope, Dr. Jose Uribe, that this gives us just the first occasion to reflect together on how in the region we can start building that financial safety net where development banks and FLAR and other institutions can talk to decide what we expect from the international community. Do we expect SDRs? Do we expect concessional credits? Well, these are actually loans, but in the long term, we're talking about a zero interest rate. So we have to be concise to what we expect, because I believe that that will help us a great deal in our discussions with the IMF Managing Director, Kristalina Georgieva, who is open and willing to discuss with the region. The World Bank has also showed its commitment to discuss the current situation. And then going back to multilateralism, I believe that one of the most important events going on right now is ECOVAX, which is an international exercise in order to allow access to the vaccine, any of the three vaccines, to all countries. 178 countries are already on board. This will be highly costly. This year we will require at least $2 billion US. About 600 or 700 million have already been raised. This is a multilateral initiative with a large scope because we are talking about a universal vaccine. So thank you very much, José Antonio Ocampo, for your wonderful, clear, and outstanding presentation. It's been a big pleasure being able to listen to you. Thank you very much, Jose, as well. Now, I'd like to turn back to our Executive President, Mr. Jose Dario Uribe. Well, thank you very much. And of course, once again, I would like to thank Professor Antonio Ocampo for his outstanding presentation, and I would like to congratulate him because, as Dr. Alistair Bárcenas said, his presentation has been really excellent. I would also like to extend my gratitude to Dr. Alistair Bárcenas. When we talked about organizing this webinar together, since, well, we believed that it was very important to do it, so we pushed it forward together. And I would also like to thank you for your supporting thoughts. It's true that the region needs to have a FLAR with a regional scope. This means that at FLAR, we intend to be not only an 8-member institution. For those of you who are not acquainted with our history, FLAR started with 5 Andean countries. Chile was the only Andean country that did not join FLAR as a member. But then Costa Rica, Uruguay joined FLAR in 2008, and Paraguay was the last country to join. But in order to build a regional FLAR, we need other large countries to join us, like Mexico or Brazil or Chile, which in turn is quite curious because Chile played a very active role at the very beginning, but for several reasons it did not join FLAR as an active member, but it can still do it, the same as Argentina. So the purpose is to build a FLAR with a much larger capacity in order to provide micro and financial stability in the region. So FLAR that way will be able to provide micro and financial stability to countries. If we do this with one country, eventually all Latin American countries will benefit. A macro financial crisis normally take a hit on neighboring countries. Therefore, this is a public asset that FLAR is offering, and therefore Ms. Bárcenas' words and Professor Ocampo's words are most welcome. So thank you so much again for your participation at this webinar. Thank you. Well, we are right on time, so we shall meet again at the next FLAR dialogue session. So thank you so much. Bye-bye. Bye, and keep safe. Bye-bye.